And that wasn't supposed to start right then. So, anyways, I was there visiting at Shiloh, and I met David. And if you guys ever get a chance to go to Israel, please go out and visit. Not only is it a great historical site, you get to see where the Tabernacle was for many years, right? And they've got a really cool observatory. They've got a whole presentation that's kind of used like a holographic sort of thing to put it up there. But then you can also go and visit the actual school. When I was there with Rico Cortez, and we were able to go through the whole school there and see all the great stuff that they're doing, and actually meet the children that were there in the school. So it was a really great time. I'd highly encourage any of you to go out there if and when you're in Israel. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to David. And thank you for coming out, David.
Okay, does that mean I'm being filmed? Yes. Okay. Not that I would do anything different, but I say what I say. And I've been doing a lot of that recently, given what's been happening in Israel. It's been a very eventful couple of months, and I remember shortly after moving to Israel, and for those of you who don't know, I originally come from a place called Brooklyn that you may have heard of. Why that always gets a laugh, I don't know, but it does. And when I moved to Israel, shortly thereafter, there was a wave of terrorist attacks, and I spoke to a friend of mine, and I said, this has been a very eventful time in Israel. And he looked at me with a smile and he said, it's always an eventful time in Israel. And it's really true. But it's also true to say that the past couple of months have been especially eventful, especially stressful, given the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenagers who were standing at a bus stop south of Jerusalem. And then, of course, the war and the month of not knowing what was going to happen, whether the Prime Minister would lead the country in the right direction. Everyone was ready for it. Everyone was ready that this was going to be the time. I'm exaggerating when I say everyone, but a majority of the people were ready for Hamas to be finished off. And this goes across the political spectrum. But it didn't happen. And I'm sorry to say that it was intentional that it didn't happen. It was planned that it wasn't going to happen. We could talk more about that after, if we have questions and answers after. But the Prime Minister did not want it to happen. He didn't want Hamas to be destroyed. It was a very conscious decision. And part of that has to do with the central message that I want you to walk away with this evening. And that is, what is the role of Israel in these times? Why is Israel a reestablished nation again? Now, I realize that this is a fairly educated audience, but I've learned not to take anything for granted. So I'm going to give you a very brief history of Israel. And when I say very brief, I mean very brief. You're going to have to listen very carefully because before you know it, it's going to be finished. Okay? 5 minutes. Okay? 5 minutes. And then we will have completed the history of Israel. Okay. Obviously, Israel traces its roots all the way back to Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we jump ahead to slavery in Egypt. Then we left slavery in Egypt. After the 10 plagues, we got out of Egypt. We came up to the Red Sea, which is properly called the Reed Sea. And R-E-E-D. That's the direct translation from the Hebrew. Somehow it got convoluted a little bit and it became the Red Sea. But it's the Reed Sea. The sea split in half. We went through. The Egyptians drowned in the sea. We came to Mount Sinai. We received the 10 Commandments. God had a 40-day and 40-night learning session with Moses. Moses comes down holding the 10 Commandments. Okay, we know that those 10 Commandments broke. He had to go back up and came down again. All right. Next, the people fall. The people fail in their faith. The golden calf. Then we're destined to spend 40 years in the desert until that generation dies off. We end up eventually getting to the land of Israel. 14 years later, after the conquest of Jericho, Joshua brings the children of Israel, the Israelites, into Shiloh. Yes, I know Americans call it Shiloh. But the original Hebrew term is Shiloh. Yes. You didn't know that Americans call it Shiloh? Yes. 65 cities or towns in the United States are called Shiloh. And that doesn't even include churches and schools named Shiloh, and Neil Diamond songs called Shiloh, and Civil War battles called Shiloh, and children of misguided movie stars called Shiloh. But the original Shiloh is called Shiloh. So from now on, we're going to say Shiloh. Now, Joshua sets up the tabernacle in Shiloh in the heart of the biblical portion of Ephraim. Why does he set it up in Ephraim? Because he was from the tribe of Ephraim. And also because there was a body of water. The Shiloh Creek was right there and still is. And also because it was central in the land, and it was a convenient place from where to send out all the children of Israel to claim their portion in the land. And indeed, that is what Joshua did. What did he say to the Israelites? Listen to these words very carefully, because these words were not just spoken for the Israelites of that time. He said, "How long will you wait? How long will you hesitate before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" Now those words weren't just said for the Israelites of that time. And those words weren't just said for the Israelis of today. And those words weren't just said for the Jews around the world. Those words were spoken for everyone who understands that God's sovereignty is on that land. And that's the lesson that we have to understand when we hear in the news about what is happening in Israel. It is totally directly related to what happened in the time of Joshua, when we were exhorted to take possession of the land. Well, some other things happened in Shiloh. The Tabernacle, 369 years stood in Shiloh, was the capital. A woman named Hannah came to pray for a son. The son who was born from those prayers was Samuel the prophet. He grew up in Shiloh, in the biblical heartland of Israel, by the way, the West Bank, for those of you who don't know. Okay, there is really no place called West Bank. By the way, how many of you have heard about the West Bank? And how many of you have read about it in your Bibles? Okay, as I said, it's an educated group. So, yes, the Romans, when they drove the Jews out of the land of Israel after the two holy temples had been destroyed, they drove the Jews, exiled the Jews from the land of Israel. They renamed the land Palestina, naming it after the Philistines, giving it a Roman derivative of the term Philistines. What greater insult can there be? For 2,000 years, the name stuck. Through all the persecutions and the expulsions in Spain and in the persecutions in Russia and in the Arab countries being dhimmis, all of this, dhimmis are second-class citizens, for those who don't know, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, more specifically. So all of this happened for 2,000 years. Then in the beginning of the 20th century, the Jews start coming back into the land of Israel, which at that point the world was calling Palestine. But there was never a country called Palestine, of course. Oh, I overwent my time limit. Okay, in 1 minute I'm going to wrap up the history of Israel. So the Jews start coming back into the land from the four corners of the earth, exactly as it said in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Jeremiah. We come back into the land of Israel. And who else starts coming into the land of Israel? Arabs. Because, why are they coming into the land of Israel? Because there's an economy being created and there are going to be jobs. And this is the true story that it isn't being told. Not by the Foreign Ministry of Israel, not by the American Secretary of State. What's his name again? The guy from Vietnam? Right. Jane Fonda's friend. Anyhow, so, sorry, I hope I didn't insult any Jane Fonda fans. So, the story is not being told. In 1948, the State of Israel was reestablished. 1967, all the Arab nations attack Israel. Oh, I left out 1964 when the PLO was created, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was created because they were not succeeding, the Arabs were not succeeding in destroying Israel. So they said, let's create an underdog. We will call them the Palestinians. We'll say the Arabs, mostly Muslims, who live here in the land of Israel are the indigenous people. And we'll say, you Jews stole our country. They're saying it to this day. You have no idea how many people go to my Facebook page and comment on it and say, you robbed our country. What country?
And what people? They were never there.
I want to know, okay, but it's true what you're saying, but I ask specific questions. What was the currency of that country called Palestine? Name one established, elected or re-elected or non-elected leader of that country called Palestine, that ancient nation? They cannot answer that question. I skipped over a part of history that relates to what you just said. You said they're Jordanians. There are no Jordanians either. That's also an invented nation, to borrow a term from Newt Gingrich. They're an invented nation. The Jordan was created from 76.8% of the British Mandate, or the land of Israel, from the Mediterranean up to Iraq. Although the land of Israel, if we want to get biblical here, the land of Israel goes even further, all the way to the Euphrates River. 1967, all the Arab nations attack. As a result of that war, Israel recaptures Judea and Samaria. Judea, the region south of Jerusalem. Samaria, the region north of Jerusalem. Recaptures eastern Jerusalem, where the holy places are the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, which really was just the retaining wall for the Temple Mount, Shiloh, Bethel, Bethlehem, Shechem, Jericho. I can go on and on. That's the West Bank. Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel. And that's what we recaptured in 6 days, and on the seventh day we rested. This is not a normal thing. How can John Kerry and Obama and Hillary and all the others, and yes, even G.W. Bush, talk about Israel as if it's some ordinary place? Anyone who does not talk about Israel in biblical terms does not understand anything about the Middle East. And that is why we've had a peace process for so many years that doesn't work. 1993, the Oslo Peace Accords are signed. Israel begins a process of withdrawal and the establishment of a Palestinian state of Arab Muslims. Thank God it hasn't happened yet, but we've gone some ways in that direction. But you cannot have a peace process that's going to work that does not take into account biblical guidelines, historical precedent, and a little bit of common sense wouldn't hurt either. We've been banging our land for peace heads against the wall for the past 50 years, and it doesn't work. It can't work. But there's a much bigger threat that people have been talking about recently, and that threat everyone's calling ISIS, ISIS, or IS, or the Islamic State. I've never seen any organization changes its mind so many times, but they're the decisive ones that everyone's afraid of. Now, there is what to be afraid of, because they are right in your face. But the ideology of ISIS, we'll call them ISIS because it's a nice catchy term, their ideology is not different from the Hamas. Their ideology is not different from the Hezbollah or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Fatah even. Their ideology is the same. They believe in Islamic domination over the world. They believe in the caliphate, which means Islamic domination over the world. And they believe in following the Sunnah, Anyone here who knows what the Sunnah is by a show of hands? Okay, there are a couple of people. The Sunnah is Muhammad, the founder of Islam. You know, the one who, if you hear the anchor people on the evening news, if they're talking about him, they always say the Prophet Muhammad. Why does he hate Jews and Christians? Because he said that he was a prophet 1400 years ago when he founded his religion. And the Jews and the Christians in the Arabian Peninsula where he lived didn't agree with him. They didn't believe him. So he became angry. He was angry anyhow because he was a neglected orphan. So he had some natural anger, which is understandable, but he was angry at the Jews and the Christians for that reason. He said, I'm gonna create my own religion. Allah is my God. The Quran became his book of his teachings. He didn't write it because he was illiterate, but he had somebody do it for him afterwards. Now Muhammad was very proud of the fact that he beheaded 700 Jews in one day. Now there's some dispute. It comes straight from their sources. It doesn't come from my book, The Islamic Tsunami. It comes from their sources. 700, 800, 900, we're not sure exactly how much. But it's clear. The concept of beheading comes from Muhammad. It's something that they do to the unbelievers, what they call the unbelievers. But that's not the biggest danger. The Islamic tsunami, there are really two Islamic tsunamis. There's the Islamic tsunami of terrorism, which is designed to frighten us, to intimidate us, so that we'll be afraid to speak out when the second and more dangerous Islamic tsunami hits, when it becomes clear to all. And that is the Islamic tsunami of demographic dominance, media takeover, political takeover, and educational takeover. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. First, we'll talk about the Islamic tsunami of terrorism. Now, mind you, I was just reading the New York Times today as I was flying in here from New York right after my flight from Israel. And I'm reading about the Sunnis fighting the Shiites. What I noticed is that it didn't say Sunni Muslims, and it didn't say Shiite Muslims. Okay, these are the two different main ethnic groups in Islam. And it reminded me of Barack Hussein Obama, because he doesn't say that either. He'll talk about Sunnis, he'll talk about Shiites, he'll talk about Al-Qaeda. Before he was just saying Al-Qaeda was the only threat. Now the Islamic State organization is suddenly a threat. But they're not Islamic organizations. The one thing that he's not mentioning, and please note, I'm not saying that he's forgetting to mention it. The thing he's not mentioning is that these Islamic organizations, that their terrorism is based on their Islam. It's based on the concept of jihad, holy war against all the unbelievers. So you won't hear him say that. In fact, when he was elected president, shortly thereafter he had a meeting with Charles Bolden, who was the head of NASA. And in this meeting, Okay, he's sitting down with the guy who's in charge of space research for the United States. So you might think he would say, let's get that space program going again, right? To build up that vision that President Kennedy had about sending an American to the moon, maybe some other kinds of research in outer space, maybe Mars, who knows? No, that's not what he discussed. The main thing that he said to him was that one of the main goals of NASA has to be to make Islamic nations, to help them to feel good about their accomplishments in math and science. This is an absolute quote from Charles Bolden, the head of NASA. Okay, who happens to be a black man, African American. So, no one can accuse him of being a racist who's out to get Obama. Bizarre. But it's not bizarre if we understand where Obama's coming from. If we understand that he was raised as a Muslim in Indonesia, if we understand that his father was a Muslim, which would make him a Muslim according to Islam, if we understand that his stepfather was a Muslim. Now, I'm not going to get into whether he was a Muslim or whether he was born in Kenya or in Hawaii. I'll leave that to Donald Trump. But I think it's important to understand where he comes from. Everyone is influenced by where they come from. I'm influenced from the fact that I grew up in Brooklyn and that I moved to Israel and that I've been in Israel 22 years. Everyone is influenced from where they come. Okay, back to the Islamic tsunami of terrorism. We in Israel know a little bit about terrorism, obviously. Some of us know more than others. In the biblical heartland of Israel, we have experienced a disproportionate amount of terrorism. And I know that Ryan said that when you come to Israel, you should come to Shiloh. Well, there are a lot of people who don't come to Shiloh because they're afraid. Even though most of the tour buses that come up to Shiloh are armored buses. And we have very good round-the-clock security. Everyone serves in security. But there is what to be concerned about, I agree. And we have had a lot of terror victims. Well, about 12, 13 years ago, I was coming back from Jerusalem, driving up from Jerusalem on the Mountain Ridge Road, the road of the patriarchs, because that was the road that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would travel on. The secular Israelis who work in the transportation ministry have given it a nice modern name, Route 60. Not realizing that, God is up on the throne pulling us like marionettes. Route 60 reminds us of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 60, which speaks about the redemption of Israel that will come through the hills of Samaria. Anyhow, it's just kind of interesting. So, there are no coincidences, by the way. So we're halfway home on this dark country road. No street lights. Halfway home, suddenly the car is hit by a massive hail of bullets. The car went completely dead. I turned around to my 3-year-old son who's sitting in the baby seat, and the bullets are flying. I felt one crash into my leg. and blood started coming out all over the place. I turned around to my son. My son's name is Rubin, or Ruby for short. I said, "Ruby, are you okay?" His eyes were staring straight ahead, wide open. His mouth was wide open. I could see that he was breathing. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out. So I quickly turned around to try to start the car. I figured he was okay, that he was probably just in shock. I turned the ignition. The car wasn't starting, it was dead. I turned it again and again. I shifted gears, park, drive, neutral each time, trying to start the car. The car wasn't starting, it was dead. It was like on a cold winter night, cold winter morning when you can't start your car. Then I closed my eyes, I held my breath, and I thought to myself, if it doesn't start now, I don't know what I'm going to do. They were still shooting, and the blood is pouring out of my leg. I turned the ignition again, and the car suddenly started. And it started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas, and I drove about 110 miles an hour, 170 kilometers an hour. I guess that's about 110 miles an hour. Hoping to get up to the next community up the road, which is called Ofra. And the whole time the car is shaking, probably from the speed I was driving. My leg was shaking and pounding, and I was trying to stop. I kept putting my hand down there to try to stop the blood flow. I just pulled up a handful of blood each time. Somehow I got to the next community up the road, Ofra. I pull up to the front gate, and you have to understand, each community in Samaria has a metal gate in the front to keep out the car bombers. And I start shouting to the guard at the gate in the booth. I start shouting to him, "Get an ambulance, please, ambulance." He didn't seem to hear me. And I couldn't shout too much louder, but fortunately there was a young woman sitting on the side of the road who started jumping up and down screaming, "Ambulance, ambulance, don't you hear?" At that point, everyone who was within sound's reach came running up to the car. The gas station attendant from across the street ran up to the car. He swung open my car door. He ripped off my shirt. He wrapped up my leg to stop the blood flow. And he said, "Don't worry, I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing." He handed me his cell phone. He said, "Call your wife." I tried to dial my cell phone. My hand was shaking too much. I couldn't dial. He dialed it for me. And I told my wife, "I've been shot in the leg. Hopefully soon an ambulance will be coming to take me to the hospital, and Ruby is okay." Well, a moment later, an ambulance did zoom up. 2 paramedics leaped out of the ambulance. They ran up to the car, and one of them pulls open the back door and starts unbuckling my son from the baby seat. I said, no, please, leave him alone. He's just in shock. He needs to be with his Abba. He needs to be with his dad. He said, "No, sir, I have to take him out." He pulls him out of the car, cradles him in his arms. He starts running at break speed back to the ambulance, shouting, he's also been shot. He's been shot in the head. A bullet had gone into his head, we later found out, where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture, and went through his neck, causing internal bleeding in the cerebellum. Well, they quickly wrapped his head with bandages, put an oxygen mask on his face, and whisked us both on stretchers into the ambulance. And they took us to the hospital in Jerusalem. We got to the hospital in Jerusalem. They put both of us in the emergency rooms, 2 separate emergency rooms. He was on the other side of the hospital in the children's wing. And they get to work on us. A few moments later, the head surgeon comes up to me, about 10 or 15 minutes later. Head surgeon comes up to me. He says, "David, I just want you to know that we're going to have to operate on both of you within the half an hour. It'll be the first of probably multiple operations. And there's someone here with me who wants to speak to you." So a man walks over. I'd never seen this guy before. He says he's the public relations director for that hospital. He says, I want you to know that you are the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in this hospital in the past year and a half. Well, I wasn't quite sure how to relate to that dubious privilege. So I thought maybe I was supposed to get a prize. I can laugh about it now. I assure you I was not laughing then. But I was a bit confused. He said, I'm telling you this because as the public relations director, my job is to protect your privacy. And the media is massed outside this emergency room because they want to interview the 1,000th victim of terrorism and photograph you and your son. And I'll keep them away. I'll protect your privacy. If that's what you wish. I thought for a moment, and I thought of all of the terror victims that we knew personally. And they used to just, these are just people who we knew in our neighborhood. There's one street in my neighborhood called I call it Terror Victims Row. The name of the street actually is the Street of Hannah's Prayer. But every house on that street has a terror victim, meaning someone who has been killed from their family. The first 7 houses. I started to think about that and those people and those children who we knew, who we once knew. And I said, you bring them in. You could bring the media in. I have what to say to them. And I've been telling this story ever since. And I tell this story not because of our personal trauma, because Lord knows there are so many families that have suffered far worse. And I tell this story not because of any political message that I have to deliver, even though I obviously have my opinions that I'm not shy about. I tell this story because it's a story of miracles. I was shot in my left leg, even though the terrorists were shooting from the right side, which enabled me to drive my automatic car to get to that ambulance. The bullet that went into my son's head and through his neck missed his brain stem by 1 millimeter. Well, those are the kinds of miracles that your average atheist will look at and kind of rationalize away. But then there are also miracles that you can't rationalize away, which we call in Hebrew, nisim niglim, revealed miracles. Like the fire on the mountain on Mount Sinai, that not one person in Israel could ignore. Like the splitting of the Red Sea. Those are revealed miracles. Well, there are also revealed miracles in these times as well. On my 5th day in the hospital, I get a call from the car mechanic. I'm laying in my hospital bed. My leg was up in the air attached to some device that was supposed to be prepared for plastic surgery that was soon to come. I get a call from the car mechanic. He says, David, I just want you to know that we have the car. We've started ordering parts. There are 49 bullet holes in the car. It's going to be a very difficult job to fix, but we're going to do our best. I said, the car? I said, I haven't thought about the car since getting shot. Who cares about the car? He said, I'm just calling you because I have to ask you a question about the car. Then there was silence on the other end for 10 seconds about. And then I hear his voice asking me the following question. Why can't we start that car? And a chill went down my back. that I feel to this day, because I know that the car went dead when the bullets hit, and I know that I tried to start it 5 or 6 times and the car wasn't starting. Finally the car started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I drove 110 miles an hour to get to that ambulance, and now he's telling me that at that point it went dead again, and they had to have it towed from there to Beit El, to the police station, because they couldn't get it to start. And the police couldn't start it, and they had to have it towed from there to Jerusalem, to the car garage. And now he's telling me the mechanics don't know why they can't start the car. Now, I have to tell you something. Personal confession. I've been a believer in the God of Israel for about 30 years. But up until that very day, I still had some of that old New York skepticism when it came to personal miracle stories. But I'm not a skeptic any longer, because we were just lifted up on God's wings to get us to that ambulance. And I knew after that day that God had planted a mission in me. I didn't know what it was. I honestly did not know where it was going. But after our 2 years of recovery, and I mean recovery, having gone through 2 operations for each of us, months of psychological therapy for my son, I started to understand what needed to be done. And it was only when my son came home from the hospital 3 weeks later, and he was walking in the middle of the night, screaming at the top of his lungs. Well, thank God he was walking again, but it was like that scream that he couldn't make in the car. And I started to understand how deep the trauma of terrorism is in the children, because we're just one example, and there are so many thousands of others. And the more people I spoke to, the more I explored this, I realized that the trauma, if it's not dealt with, in children especially, then it comes out in all the wrong ways. It comes out in aggressiveness towards other children that's unexpected. It comes out in sleepless nights, in panic attacks. And I think of a very personal example. My daughter, when she was 13 years old, she was out at a school activity. This was several years after this terrorist attack. And she came home, and my wife and I were out at a high school graduation for an older child, and they told us to turn off our cell phones. So our cell phones were off. Anyhow, my daughter comes back from this evening activity at the school, and the babysitter tells her, "I've been trying to reach your parents. I don't know why I can't reach them. They're not answering their phones." My daughter went into a total panic. She started calling the neighbors, calling friends, calling relatives, and anybody who she could get to, saying, "I don't know where my parents are. I think they've been shot." She was in a state of total hysteria. Now that's just one family. There's so many others. And that's when I decided to start the Shiloh Israel Childrens Fund, with the purpose of healing the trauma of the terrorism in the children of the biblical heartland of Israel, and at the same time rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel through those children. So we set up a therapy center that uses music and art and animals. We have a petting zoo, a horse farm, and well, with God's help, we're really performing miracles for the children. Well, it's God's miracles, but He showed the way on that. Well, I'll talk more about that after, but that's the first Islamic tsunami that I was talking about, the Islamic tsunami of terrorism. But there's another Islamic tsunami, and that is it's a quieter one. It's just as aggressive, and that is the Islamic tsunami of changing Western civilization from a Judeo-Christian civilization to an Islamic civilization. And that includes demographics. Your average American family today has 1 to 2 children per family. And of course a dog and a cat. In fact, I think that sometimes, and I'm saying it in a joking way, but I'm very serious about this. I drive through America from speaking engagement to speaking engagement, and I very often pass pet department stores. I definitely pass more pet department stores than baby stores. What does that say about where Western civilization is going? But your average Muslim family has 7 to 8 children per family. The Muslim population in the Western world is the fastest growing population. Well, it could be that the average is more like 5 or 6, but there are many families with 7 or 8 children and even more. And sometimes they have multiple wives, so you can add it up. Do your basic arithmetic. Those are the trends. That's where it's going. And it's been proven that the second generation of Muslim immigrants doesn't have less children and holds views that are just as extreme as the first generation immigrants, if not more extreme. And many of those volunteers for ISIS come from the United States or from England. This is the reality. This is the Islamic tsunami of demography. And then, of course, there are the attempts to impose Sharia law on an unsuspecting nation. What is Sharia law? That is the oppressive Islamic law that says that it's okay to beat your wives. That says that it's okay that a thief, a shoplifter, should have his hands cut off. This is a religion of no mercy. That says that you should kill a Muslim who changes his religion. That says that if a Muslim comes to your town and needs a place to stay, you have to put him up. The Sharia law that says that it is forbidden to build a church, a synagogue, or any place of worship other than a mosque. That says that you can't even renovate a place of worship other than a mosque. And guess what? They're also infiltrating the educational system. There are charter schools throughout the United States. I have not checked in Minnesota. I'm not sure how many there are in Minnesota. Maybe someone else knows. They are Islamic charter schools, public schools that are paid for with taxpayer funds and supplemented by wealthy Muslims from the Persian Gulf and from Turkey. There are 47 of them in the state of Texas alone. This is what's happening today, and they're infiltrating the public schools themselves with extracurricular activities and the universities. The universities and the Ivy League system that once had Hebrew as a prerequisite. The Ivy League has come a long way, hasn't it? Well, I've said a few things about President Barack Obama. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that President Obama is not the foundation of America. And there have been other presidents that have been very strongly pro-Israel. And it's vital that people understand this. George Washington spoke to the Hebrew congregation of Savannah, Georgia. And he spoke of the blessings that will come to the United States of America through this congregation. Meaning that particular Jewish congregation, because he understood Genesis 12. John Adams and John Quincy Adams both spoke about how they would favor the return of Israel to its land again as a sovereign nation. That was in the early 1800s. Okay, 150 years before the state of Israel was reestablished. Abraham Lincoln also spoke about Israel a little bit. He was approached by a Christian Zionist trying to get him behind the movement to repatriate the Jews to their land and to reestablish Israel as a sovereign nation. And Abraham Lincoln, well, he had a sort of a wry sense of humor. He said that he liked the idea. He said, my chiropodist, I guess that's what they call chiropractors in those days. My chiropodist is a Jew who has put me on my feet so many times that I should have no problem giving his countrymen a leg up. That was Lincoln. Let me tell you about one more president, Harry Truman. Harry Truman was the president at the time of the reestablishment of the State of Israel. And Harry Truman also was the first world leader to recognize that reestablished state. Shortly thereafter, he was visited by the chief rabbi of Israel, who was named Rabbi Herzog. And Rabbi Herzog came in, sat down with the president, and he opens up his Bible. He starts reading from the Bible, from the book of Ezra, which talks about King Cyrus, the Persian king who helped to finance the rebuilding of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem after its destruction. What do you think the president did when the chief rabbi opened up his Bible? Nobody's guessing, huh? That's right. Good. The president opened up his own Bible. Now, why is that so significant? Well, yes, for one thing, it's significant that to remember that there was a time when presidents did have Bibles. Not holy Korans. But not just for that reason. I'm going to tell you something about Shiloh that relates directly to this. I told you about the woman Hannah who grew up, who prayed for her son in the Tabernacle in Shiloh, and the son who was born was Samuel the prophet, right? Samuel the prophet appointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. But why? Why did he appoint a king? The people went to him and they said, because they were so upset about the division of the people during the period of the judges, they said, appoint a king and he will rule over us like all the other nations. Well, Samuel understood that the people wanted a strong leader. It's not an unreasonable request. He also understood the importance of democracy. that what the people want, we the people, is important and biblical. However, Samuel was also very skeptical because he also understood that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So he consulted the Almighty like any good prophet would, and God told him, yes, appoint a king, but attach conditions to it. One of those conditions was that the king would have to write his own Torah scroll, his own Bible, and have it with him at all times, so that he would remember who the real king is, and that he would look to the real king for guidance in making the decisions. Like I spoke about before with the peace process, that we need to be looking at the king for guidance, looking at what the Torah says for guidance. And that's why it's significant that Harry Truman had his own Bible. So he opens it up and they read together, and they read about King Cyrus, who helped to support and to finance the rebuilding of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. When the rabbi read these words, President Truman burst into tears. Now remember, this is Harry Truman we're talking about. Harry Truman's campaign slogan was, "Give him hell, Harry." He was a pretty tough guy. But when it came to Israel, he always became emotional. And why? Because Harry Truman was biblically connected. And that is our challenge. That is our challenge in Israel, and it's your challenge in America. To get biblically connected again and to help people to become biblically connected again. Because if we're biblically connected, then we'll start to understand what's going on. And I realize that George W. Bush said that he was a born-again Christian, and I'm not doubting him. And I know that Jimmy Carter said that he was a born-again Christian. But I got news for you. They weren't biblically connected. Because if they were biblically connected, they wouldn't be talking about Israel being forced to give up its biblical heartland. That is anti-biblical. And if Prime Minister Netanyahu, who Americans think is the greatest thing to hit the United States since apple pie, if they really understood that the Prime Minister is not biblically connected, then they would understand how Israel can start a war and stop in the middle because this guy in the White House is telling him to stop. Now, okay, I spoke about that earlier. I sort of hinted at that earlier. It wasn't just because Obama told him to stop. It was also because he was afraid of taking control of Gaza. He was afraid of what are we going to do with it once we have it. Well, there are solutions for that. But Joshua said, "How long will you wait before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" Those aren't just some words from literature, from the heritage of Israel. Those are words to be followed through on and to be carried out. Now I'm going to tell you in just a few minutes what my solutions are for peace in the Middle East, in Israel specifically. And that peace plan is called Peace for Peace. P-E-A-C-E. For P-E-A-C-E. If they really want peace, they could have it in a minute. But that peace has to be under Israeli sovereignty over the land of Israel, and it has to be based on the borders of Israel from the Mediterranean all the way to the Euphrates River. Okay, but for now it can be up until the Jordan River. I'm not saying that Israel should attack Jordan immediately and attack Egypt and attack Lebanon. However, as he did in 1967, God does create opportunities, and we're supposed to seize those opportunities when He gives us those opportunities. In the Six-Day War, we seized the opportunity, with the exception of the Temple Mount, but we seized the opportunity. Okay, that's number one. Israeli sovereignty over the land of Israel. Unlimited Israeli sovereignty over the land of Israel, which means the end of the Palestinian Authority. You can't have any other governmental or quasi-governmental sovereignty over the land of Israel. Number two, what do you do when you have all of those Arabs in Judea and Samaria and Gaza? What do you do with them? Well, it's very simple. A path to loyal citizenship would be offered, just like there are Arab citizens within Israel. A path to loyal citizenship would be offered for the Arab residents of Judea and Samaria. No, you don't give them citizenship. You have a path to loyal citizenship. What does that mean? A 2 to 3 year course in Zionist and biblical history and the Hebrew language. Number two, if they pass that course, they have to make a commitment to perform 2 to 3 years of national service to Israel, just like every other Israeli citizen. And number three, an oath of loyalty to the state of Israel with hand-on Bible. Okay, please note that last part of what I said. Why with hand-on Bible? How many of you have ever heard of Keith Ellison? Oh, that's right, I'm in Minnesota. Okay, usually no hands go up. Okay, so I'll bet a lot of you know that he took his oath of loyalty to the United States in Congress, that oath of loyalty, with his hand on the Quran, because of Nancy Pelosi allowing that. And then he said afterwards that this shows what a pluralistic country the United States is. And I'm taking my oath of loyalty on the Quran of Thomas Jefferson, from the Thomas Jefferson Library. But he didn't say why Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Thomas Jefferson and the United States were suffering from the Barbary pirates, the first Islamic terrorist organization that harassed the United States out at sea. They were hijacking American ships, taking American ships ransom, holding hostages, everything that they do today. I imagine there will also be beheadings. Washington didn't know how to deal with it. And there was no United States Navy at that time. Adams didn't know how to deal with it. When Jefferson was elected president, he went out and he bought a Quran to understand the mentality of these people who are harassing the United States and taking millions in ransom. And then he sent out the Marines. And from that comes the theme song of the Marines, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Right? What is now Libya. That's the lesson that we learn from Thomas Jefferson. And that's why an oath of loyalty to the state of Israel or the United States should be taken with hand on Bible. Well, I got news for you. Most of those Arabs in Judea and Samaria would not take. They would refuse the path of loyal citizenship. Some might take that path, and if they really do and they go through it, I have no problem with them becoming Israeli citizens. If they refuse to, well, then a small amount would be allowed to stay, depending on the needs of Israel, because people can stay in a country without being citizens. However, those who remain and are hostile to the state of Israel still, well, then we need to look at a biblical solution. And we find that in the book of Numbers. So if you have a Tanakh, you have a Bible with you, just take a look. Chapter 33. Verse 50. And God spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan, meaning the Jordan River, there is no country, remember, to the land of Canaan, shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Very interesting. Let's jump ahead to verse 55 in the same chapter. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, those of them whom you leave there, who you allow to remain, shall be pins in your eyes and thorns in your side, and shall forever harass you in the land in which you dwell. And it shall be that what I had meant to do to them, I shall do to you. And from that we can understand the withdrawals of Israel in recent times. Those who are enemies of Israel need to be removed from Israel. Those who want to live in peace, bavakasha, meaning welcome, you can stay. But only if you're prepared to live peacefully under the sovereignty of Israel and under the sovereignty of the God of Israel. So when I come to America and elsewhere and I speak about Israel, I also speak about what God expects of the Christian world. When we say Judeo-Christian civilization, we're saying that because the United States comes from biblical roots. First chancellor of Harvard University was fluent in Hebrew because he wanted to know the Bible in the original. So let's read something. I'd like to conclude my presentation with these particular verses which relate to what I'm saying here about standing with Israel. Jeremiah chapter 31. For those of you who don't know, Jeremiah was a prophet at the time of the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. But in these verses that I'm about to read, he wasn't speaking about the temple in Jerusalem. And he wasn't speaking about back then. He's speaking about now. And he's speaking about Shiloh, about Samaria, Mount Ephraim. So let's see what he says. Anybody here who knows Hebrew? So if I read in Hebrew, will you understand? Okay, but just the two of you, that's not fair. I'll read it in English. And I have loved you with an eternal love. Okay, God is speaking to the Israelites. Therefore I have extended kindness to you. I shall yet rebuild you, and you shall be rebuilt, O maiden of Israel. You will yet adorn yourself with drums, and go forth in the dance of merrymakers. You will yet plant vineyards in the mountains of Samaria. The planters will plant and redeem. For there will be a day when watchmen will call out on Mount Ephraim, Arise, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God. Well, these words are very interesting because, yes, we know that the land of Israel, that the biblical heartland of Samaria is being rebuilt in these times. And we know that there are vineyards, well, at least I know, that there are vineyards all around Shiloh. There are olive groves, there are fig trees. The land is being reborn, literally. But who are these watchmen that will call out on Mount Ephraim? Now we go to the original Hebrew. The word that's used for watchmen in the original Hebrew is notzrim. In modern Hebrew, notzrim means Christians. So what do you think God is talking about here? There will come a day when watchmen will call out on Mount Ephraim. God expects everyone, including Christians specifically, to be calling out on Mount Ephraim, to be standing with Israel in these times. Everyone needs to be involved. So how does one get involved? Okay, how does one get involved in standing with Israel? By the way, you should know that there are some Jews who say to me, they say, but there were no Notzrim, there were no Christians in the time of Jeremiah. So it can't be speaking about the Christians. It's talking about prophets or visionaries. In fact, here in my Tanakh here, my Bible, where I have Hebrew and English, they don't translate it as Christians. But all it takes is a little common sense to understand that what they're saying here is that Christians need to be involved. Because Jeremiah wasn't speaking about back then.
I just looked it up really fast. That's the only time that word appears in the Hebrew Bible in that level.
Right. Obviously it means something. So, how does a Christian or any non-Jew stand with Israel in these times? Well, there are basically three ways that I focus on, that I think everyone should be standing with Israel. Through prayer, number one. We believe that God hears prayer. Prayer is important. The power of prayer is tremendous. Number two, get politically involved. I don't care how apolitical you may be, you need to become politically active. because it's the grassroots that can change things. And it's essential to demand that the political leadership stand with Israel, but not just stand with Israel in biblically correct ways. It's not enough to say, as many members of the Democratic Party especially say, and yes, I know there are some Republicans also who may be problematic in that area, but many of them will say, we stand with Israel. We support Israel. And then at the Democratic Convention, they won't put a resolution in saying that they stand with United Jerusalem. Or God, for that matter. It's a problem. If you're not biblically consistent, then you're not standing with Israel. You can't have it both ways. You can't support a Palestinian state, the so-called two-state solution, or land for peace, and say that you're a supporter of Israel. It's inconsistent. Last but not least, partner directly with those who are on the front lines in the land of Israel. Yes, I know there are some good Christian organizations, Christian Zionist organizations that are involved in helping in different ways in Israel. But the best way to support Israel, if you want to give a donation, give it directly to the projects for the children, in my case, or for other people in Israel who are active on the ground. That's how you really make a difference. And I know you were there, so you saw what I'm talking about. And before I show this short film about the Shiloh Israel Childrens Fund and where you could see what we're doing on the ground, I just want to say one thing, that every one of you is invited personally to come to Israel, to come to Shiloh, and to get in touch with me and to come for a visit and to get the full tour. And I really mean, from the heart, it's an invitation. And b'vakasha. And I'll just tell you one short story related to that, very short. I had a trip to Texas and New Mexico about 6 or 7 years ago. And I was there for 3 weeks. And I came back after my 3 weeks. And I came home, and my wife had been home taking care of 6 kids by herself. And you see, that's how you overcome the demographic problem. In Judea and Samaria, we have the fastest growing population in the Western world. Good. Baruch Hashem. Thank God. And I'll say this as well in relation to that. In my book, The Islamic Tsunami, there are a lot of other solutions to solving the demographic problem. But in terms of immigration, in terms of all kinds of things. But there's nothing better than having children. And you know, you can do it. I mean, there are families in Shiloh with 10 and 12 children, and somehow they all come out okay. You know, you have the older children helping the younger children, and it's not the parents abdicating their responsibility, it's the parents teaching the teenagers responsibility. So it's because teenagers need to learn responsibility. I have several at home. I know what I'm talking about. Anyhow, how did I get off on that tangent? So my wife is at home with the 6 kids, and And I come back from Israel all tired and exhausted. And then I realized she was more exhausted than I was. So I said, okay, the least I could do for you is that you go to sleep early tonight and sleep late tomorrow. I will get the kids up in the morning and off to school. So, sure enough, I had jet lag. I didn't sleep a wink that night. But I did get the kids off to school. Then I went over to the sofa in the living room and I collapsed on the sofa. I fell asleep. I fell into a deep sleep, or I thought it was a deep sleep. Then I hear someone banging on the front door. And I jump up and I run to the front door. There's nobody there. So I go back to the sofa, kind of relieved. I went back to sleep. And then it must have been a moment later, I hear someone walking in my backyard, which is right near the sofa. So I open up the door, I look outside, and indeed there's this guy who I had never seen before. And I said, Slicha, Shiloh Zolacha? And he didn't seem to understand me, as most of you probably didn't. So I said it in English. I said, excuse me, can I help you? And he turns around with a big smile on his face and he says, you're David Rubin. I saw you on television. I said, yeah. He said, I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I said, well, okay, nice to meet you. He said, well, you did say we could visit you, didn't you? True story, no exaggeration. So I looked at my watch. I said, well, I guess I did say that. Well, I have a little time, so I'll give you the tour, sure. And so we went and I gave him the full tour. We went down to the school and, the two schools, the therapeutic educational complex. We went into a Bible lesson, and the children were learning Bible through song. In Shilo, the children learn Bible through song because we want God to be not just in their heads, but also in their hearts. And then, so that was very moving, of course. And then we went into the petting zoo, and we went on to the therapy center, and he got the full description of what we're doing with the projects with the children. We even went up to the horse farm. And then we went down to ancient Shiloh, and I gave him the full tour there, and we went to the site of the Tabernacle, where the Tabernacle stood for 369 years, and he said some prayers, and then he gave me a very nice donation for the Shiloh Israel Childrens Fund. Why do I tell this story? Because it convinced me, number one, that how important it is, even if it's sometimes inconvenient for me, it's important to show people, to have people actually see for themselves what we're doing there. And it also reminded me of how important it is to invite people to come and visit. And even if it might not be at a convenient time for me, but you're all invited. And if you come to Israel and you know in advance you're going to come, please send me an email first. So, anyhow, thank you very much for hearing me tonight, and God bless you, God bless Israel, and God bless the United States of America.